The Galactic Empire stretched its dominion across countless worlds, forged by centuries of conquest and unchallenged power. From one side of the galaxy to the other, their banners flew across skies that once belonged to free civilizations there. Fleets cut through space like blades of fire and steel, and everywhere they went they carried the same message of submission and silence. To resist was to vanish, to obey was to survive. In the grand halls of the Empire, Earth was spoken of as little more than a primitive sphere, a planet drenched in oceans and covered with cities that seemed fragile compared to the technological marvels of the stars. The Emperor's advisors dismissed its people as stubborn yet weak, a species whose passion was impressive but whose weapons and defenses were laughable compared to the titans of the galaxy. Earth was useful only as a resource, a planet that would kneel and give without question once reminded of its insignificance. So when the Empire came to Earth, they did not come with diplomacy. They came with shadows cast by colossal ships that darkened the blue skies, ships that hummed with the power of 1,000 suns. Their soldiers marched in perfect rhythm across the ground, their armor shining with cold precision, their weapons humming with lethal energy. They did not need to speak because their presence spoke louder than any threat ever could. The people of Earth were stunned, and in their hearts they carried both awe and terror. For generations, they had dreamed of life beyond their small planet. They had looked to the stars with wonder and hope, yet when the stars answered, they did not bring friendship or exploration. They brought chains. The Empire moved swiftly. They seized control of governments, dismantled armies, and planted their banners atop the tallest towers. They silenced resistance before it could breathe, forcing leaders to pledge loyalty under the eyes of soldiers whose gaze felt colder than death. The world fell in line as fear seeped into every corner, and the daily life of humanity bent under the weight of an authority it could not challenge. But even as the Empire pressed its boot upon the neck of Earth, humanity endured. Its silence was not acceptance, its obedience was not loyalty. It was the silence of people watching, waiting, and learning. It was the obedience of those who dreamed of freedom, even as they whispered to one another behind closed doors. The will of humanity did not break, it hardened. The Empire could not see this. They had long grown blind to the resilience of those they conquered. They looked upon Earth and saw only another world among thousands, a planet that would feed their machines and supply their armies. They did not see the sparks beneath the surface, sparks waiting for the slightest breath of air to become a fire. For in every shadow there remained a hidden ember of resistance, in every home a whisper that the Empire could not kill. Earth was not yet defeated, it was merely waiting for the wound that would awaken its fury. The soldiers of the Empire spread across continents as though the entire planet was a conquered fortress. Their boots struck pavement with the rhythm of war drums, and their ships hovered above cities like metal clouds. Their presence turned day into eternal twilight. Every eye lifted upward with dread, and every heart sank lower under the pressure of the unknown. The very air seemed heavier with them there, as though the planet itself groaned beneath their weight. In markets, where once voices argued and bartered, only whispers remained. In classrooms, where teachers once spoke of human discovery and ambition, now sat lessons written by imperial decree. Children were told to forget the stories of their nations and learn instead the history of the Empire, a history written in conquest and obedience, a history that erased the memory of freedom and replaced it with the inevitability of change. The Empire enforced its control not only with weapons but with fear. They selected individuals at random to vanish into the void. Some were leaders who resisted, some were workers accused of disobedience, others were merely chosen as reminders of the power that could strike without reason or mercy. Their families cried out, but no answer came. No body was returned, and silence became the only shield the people could cling to. Yet in that silence humanity endured, its spirit retreating deeper rather than breaking. Mothers told their children old stories in secret about heroes who had risen against impossible odds. Fathers whispered the truth of the sky, that Earth had been free once and would be free again. Every whisper carried more power than the Empire realized, for in those whispers lived defiance, and in that defiance lived the seed of rebellion. The Empire continued to underestimate this small blue world. They saw humans working in their factories, carrying imperial orders, building imperial structures, and they mistook this labor for loyalty. What they did not see was the hatred building in every motion. What they did not understand was that obedience forced by fear is fragile and fleeting. In the villages, the cities, the mountains, and the deserts, Small acts of resistance began to take shape, a farmer hiding food from the requisitions, a teacher slipping forbidden knowledge into the lessons, a worker breaking a machine and pretending it was an accident. These were not yet revolutions, but they were sparks. Sparks hidden beneath ash and shadows waiting for a single gust of wind to flare into unstoppable fire. The Empire could not imagine that such a primitive planet could ever rise. Against them they did not believe that unity could come from such fractured people. They measured power only in ships and weapons, never in willpower, never in memory, never in rage, and so they believed the silence of Earth was victory, but it was not. It was the pause before the storm, the drawing of breath before the scream, the heartbeat that grows louder with each second until it burst. The Empire had conquered worlds for centuries, but never before had they faced humanity, a species that carries in its bones the memory of struggle and in its soul the hunger for freedom, and though they did not know it yet, they had already sown the seeds of their greatest mistake. Far from the towering cities where the banners of the Empire fluttered in the choking winds, there lay a small village resting between green hills and flowing rivers, untouched by the steel and smoke of conquest. The people here lived quietly, though. Even here the shadow of the Empire stretched across the land. Soldiers passed through on patrols taking food and supplies, but they did not linger, and so life continued in a fragile balance in this village. There was a child whose laughter carried through the air like a song, and whose eyes held the brightness of stars before the darkness of the Empire could dim them. The child was known by everyone, for in such a small place, every face was familiar, and every bond was shared. The child played in the fields and ran along the river, their small feet splashing water that glittered in the sunlight, while parents and elders watched with smiles, weary yet warmed to the villagers. The child was more than just a young life growing. They were a symbol that innocence still survived, even under the suffocating rule of the Empire. When people heard the laughter of the child, they remembered joy. When they saw the carefree steps, they remembered freedom. The child carried no weapon, no banner, and yet carried hope more powerful than either. The Empire did not know of this child, for to them villages were insignificant dots on maps, places to be visited only for tribute or reminders of authority. Their soldiers moved through without care, their eyes blind to the small wonders of life that endured beneath their boots. But the people of the village understood that this child was the heart of their spirit, a living reminder that even when the stars turned hostile, Earth still belonged to itself. As days passed, the child became a story whispered across the hills. Travelers carried the tale from one home to another of a child whose joy could not be taken, of a child who smiled even as the Empire pressed down upon the world. For some, it was only a tale. For others, it was a promise that humanity was not yet defeated. Parents held their children closer when they heard the story, and told them they too must never forget to laugh. They too must never forget to live, for as long as a child could play, there was still a future to protect, and as long as a child could laugh, there was still a reason to fight. The child did not know of these whispers, nor of the hope they carried in their small steps. They did not understand the power of their presence. They only lived as children do, chasing light, chasing dreams, finding wonder in the simple gifts of Earth, and in that innocence they unknowingly carried the spirit of a world that refused to surrender. The Empire had conquered, empires had erased, histories had silenced entire civilizations, yet they had never understood the strength that lies in the smallest of lives. They could not imagine that one child could become the center of a storm. They could not fathom that laughter could plant rebellion deeper than any speech, and so they did not see the danger nor the power that grew quietly in a village far from their gaze. For in the heart of Earth, it was not a general or a leader or a soldier who first lit the spark. It was a child whose life carried the weight of a world and whose fate would awaken a fury the Empire would never escape. The day began as quietly as any other in the small village. The sun rose slowly above the hills, bathing the fields in a golden glow. The river sang softly as it moved between the stones, and the people carried on with their work. Children played in the grass, their voices carrying joy across the valley, while elders watched and spoke of times before the shadow of the Empire had fallen. Then the sound came first, a low hum that trembled in the air like a storm approaching. It grew louder with each breath. The villagers shared uneasy glances, for they had heard such sounds before. It was the sound of machines, the sound of ships, the sound that meant the Empire was near. The sky darkened as an imperial transport descended, heavy and unyielding, blotting out the light as it came closer. Dust and wind rushed across the ground as it landed, its hull marked with the cold symbols of the Empire. The doors opened with a hiss, and from within marched soldiers, their armor gleaming under the sun, their faces hidden behind masks that betrayed no emotion, no humanity. The villagers stood frozen, some clutching their children, others lowering their eyes to the ground, for they knew any sign of defiance could bring punishment. The soldiers spread out across the village, their movements precise and unhurried, as if they knew they owned the ground they walked upon. One soldier spoke in a voice amplified through a metallic device, demanding tribute, food, supplies, anything of value. The words carried no warmth, no mercy. They were not a request, but an order, a law carved into stone by the presence of the Empire. The villagers nodded and hurried to gather what they could, their hands trembling as they placed baskets of grain, jars of water, and small tools at the feet of their oppressors. The soldiers moved among the houses without asking permission, entering at will, searching for hidden resistance, though there was none. Every step they took left the villagers more suffocated. The children clung to their parents in silence, their earlier laughter gone, replaced by fear that seemed too heavy for such small shoulders. Among the children stood the one whose joy had carried hope through the village. Their wide eyes stared at the soldiers, not with defiance, but with the innocence of someone who had not yet learned the cruelty of the galaxy. They did not understand the weight of the moment. They only saw strange figures in shining armor, and wondered why everyone was so afraid. The soldiers did not see a symbol, they saw only a crowd of villagers who must learn their place, and so they marched without care, their weapons gleaming as a warning, their voices sharp and cold. The atmosphere thickened with dread. Every villager knew that at any moment cruelty could arrive, for the Empire never needed a reason to crush what was small and fragile. The village that had been filled with laughter and life only hours before now stood in silence, broken by the heavy steps of strangers who carried no compassion. The presence of the Empire turned a peaceful home into a stage of fear, and though no blood had yet been spilled, every heart beat faster, every hand trembled, for all could sense that the shadow above them was not finished, and the storm had only just begun. The soldiers continued their search with ruthless efficiency, their boots echoing across the narrow paths of the village, their cold voices commanding silence and obedience, while their armored hands pulled open doors and tore through the few belongings of the villagers who stood powerless to resist. Every step they took filled the air with dread, and every glance they cast felt like a blade pressed against the skin of those who dared look up. The villagers gathered near the center, watching helplessly as their lives were turned upside down, the baskets of grain taken, the tools thrown into piles, the small treasures of families scattered in the dust. The soldiers did not speak to the villagers except to bark orders, their movements mechanical, their eyes hidden behind black glass that reflected no feeling. Among the crowd, the child stood with wide eyes, uncomprehending of why the day had changed so suddenly, why the laughter that had filled the fields in the morning had been swallowed by fear. The child clung to a small toy carved from wood, holding it tight as if it were a shield against the cold presence of the Empire. One soldier noticed the child not for who they were, but simply because their gaze lingered too long, their expression too curious. In a world where even the smallest gesture could be seen as defiance, that curiosity became a threat. The soldier turned slowly, their shadow falling across the child, and the crowd stiffened. Mothers reached for their children, fathers clenched their fists, but none dared move. The soldier spoke a single word that no one understood, a command that carried only menace. Then, without hesitation, they raised their weapon. A crack split the air, a sound unnatural and final, and in an instant, the laughter that had carried hope across the hills was silenced forever. The child fell, and the wooden toy slipped from their hand, landing in the dust beside them. For a moment, the world itself seemed to stop. The villagers stared in disbelief, their hearts unable to accept what had happened. The silence was absolute, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers looked on without care for them. It was nothing more than a demonstration of power, an act meant to remind the villagers of their place, of the price of being noticed. A wail broke the silence, the voice of a mother shattering the stillness, as she fell to the ground, clutching the small body in her arms. Her cries rose into the sky, raw with grief, her voice trembling with a pain that cut through every soul who heard it. Others wept quietly, their faces hidden, their hands trembling. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight, while others stared with eyes that burned with fury. The soldiers did not stay. They gathered what they had taken and marched back to their transport, their boots pounding against the earth, each step heavier than the last, until the ship rose again into the sky, leaving behind silence that no longer carried obedience but grief that would never heal. The village remained still, but beneath that stillness something had changed forever. The people had seen innocence crushed, not because of resistance but because of indifference, and that indifference awakened something that the Empire had never expected. It was not only grief that filled the hearts of the villagers. It was anger, anger that would spread far beyond their hills, anger that would echo across Earth and become the voice of a planet no longer willing to kneel. Word of the child's death traveled faster than the winds that swept across Earth, faster than the currents that moved through oceans and rivers, from one village to another, from one city to the next. Whispers became shouts, messages were carried by travelers, by merchants, by the networks that the Empire thought were harmless. The story of the child who had been struck down for no reason other than their existence spread like fire across the planet, and every person who heard it felt the weight of injustice pressing upon their chest. In the crowded cities, people stopped in their tracks when they heard the news, their faces pale, their eyes wide. The normal rhythm of daily life was interrupted as citizens paused to understand what had happened. A child who had symbolized hope for a small village had been taken by strangers from the stars, and the cruelty of it seemed impossible to bear. Their grief was raw and sharp, and it cut through the hearts of all who learned the truth, clutched their children tighter, telling them quietly that the world had become cruel, but that they must survive, that they must remember that even in sorrow, there was power. The streets filled with murmurs of anger that slowly began to grow louder. Whispers of injustice became conversations of outrage, debates in cafes, in homes, in hidden meeting places about what it meant, about how it could happen, and about who had the right to take life without reason. Workers in factories paused their labor for a moment and spoke quietly among themselves about the unfairness of the Empire. They compared the loss of a child in a distant village to the losses in their own lives, to the fear that had built up over months and years, and they realized that grief had become too heavy to carry. Silently, sorrow became fuel, and that fuel ignited the beginnings of fury that would not be contained. In the countryside, farmers stopped tending their fields for a moment and looked up at the sky, imagining the ships that carried the soldiers who had killed the child. They shared their grief with neighbors in secret gatherings, in barns, in basements, in the quiet spaces where the Empire could not see them. Their anger grew not only at the act, but at the arrogance that the Empire believed they could control hearts and minds, with far across oceans, across deserts, across mountains. The story spread. News traveled through the networks of humanity, unbroken by borders, by language, by culture, and everywhere the result was the same: sorrow first, and then anger. Anger that transformed into determination. Determination that whispered that life could not be silenced, that innocence had been stolen, but that humanity would endure, and that the Empire had made a mistake that would cost them dearly. For the first time in generations, Earth was united in a single emotion. A planet that had obeyed quietly was no longer silent. The child had died, but in death they had awakened a voice that could not be ignored. Grief had become fury, and that fury began to pulse through every city and village, through every heart and mind, ready to rise against the Empire that had thought them powerless. The grief that had swept across Earth became a shared heartbeat, a rhythm that pulsed through cities and villages, through deserts and forests, through mountains and plains, and it carried with it a strange power, the kind that had long been buried beneath the weight of fear and obedience. The people of Earth began to realize that they were not alone, that every home that had felt sorrow was connected to every other home that had felt loss, and that connection carried strength from the smallest villages where farmers whispered plans in hidden barns to the towering cities where office workers passed coded messages between each other. The people began to speak in one voice, not yet loud enough for the Empire to hear, but loud enough for themselves to feel that they were no longer isolated, that their grief was shared and their anger was valid, and that anger could be transformed into action. Communities that had once competed for resources or status now reached across the invisible lines that divided them, offering help, sharing information, and forming bonds that had never existed before. The streets became places of whispered strategy. The forests and hills became secret meeting points where plans could be made. The rivers and coasts carried messages faster than any messenger could run, and everywhere the pulse of unity grew stronger with every passing day. The leaders of these communities were not generals or politicians, but ordinary people who had refused to remain silent, mothers who had lost children, fathers who had felt powerless, workers who had labored under imperial control, students who had watched the world bend Beneath oppression they took the grief that had almost crushed them and reshaped it into resolve. The child who had been killed became their symbol, their rallying point, the spark that reminded them that life and innocence and freedom were worth fighting for across his continents. The message spread that humanity would no longer kneel. The people shared tactics not of violence but of resilience, ways to protect their homes, to hide their knowledge, to preserve their culture, to strengthen their spirits, so that when the moment came to act, they would act as one, a network of determination and courage invisible to the Empire, yet powerful beyond imagining. In the cities where the Empire believed its control was absolute, workers sabotaged machines, they spread news to each other, they found ways to communicate that could not be monitored, they did small acts of defiance that taught them that fear could be replaced with agency, and that each tiny act was a stone in the foundation of rebellion. The Empire had expected fear to divide the people, but instead it had united them. Grief had become a bond, and sorrow had become fuel. The heartbeat of Earth grew louder and stronger, and from it arose a quiet certainty that they could not be defeated, that their unity was a force greater than any weapon the Empire could deploy, and that the day would come when the child's death would be avenged, not with vengeance alone but with the power of a planet united against injustice. For in every city, every village, every hidden corner of Earth, the people whispered to each other a single promise that echoed silently through hearts ready to rise, that they would endure, they would resist, they would awaken a fury the Empire could not comprehend, and that unity had become their greatest weapon. The Empire had believed that silence was the sound of obedience, that fear was the chain that would hold humanity forever, but they had been wrong. For the people of Earth had learned that patience and observation could become weapons as powerful as any fleet or laser that had ever crossed the stars, and the first acts of defiance began quietly, invisible to the soldiers and officers who thought they ruled every street, and field workers in factories refused to follow orders, exactly breaking machines in ways that seemed accidental to the Empire, while secretly documenting weaknesses in their systems. Engineers and scientists who had been forced to serve the Empire began to study its technology, finding vulnerabilities in engines, in shields and weapons, and sharing that knowledge through hidden networks, so that when the time came, the information could be used against its creators. Farmers hid food from requisitioned supplies, diverting portions to those who were most in need. They shared maps of patrols and observation points with neighbors in secret gatherings, so that families could move safely through territories controlled by imperial forces. In cities, street vendors and messengers passed coded notes carrying information from one part of the world to another, creating invisible lines of communication that allowed strategy to flow undetected. Children who had been told to forget the history of their nations found ways to preserve knowledge through games, through drawings, through songs they did not understand yet, that they were learning the same lesson as the adults, that survival required not only obedience but creativity and courage, that imagination itself could become a weapon in the hands of those who refused to bow. Across continents, people began to train in secret, practicing skills that had once seemed ordinary but now became preparation for resistance, agility, precision planning. They learned to observe without being seen, to strike without warning, and to disappear into the shadows, leaving no trace that could be followed by the Empire. Their resolve was strengthened by the memory of the child whose life had been taken, whose laughter had once been a light across a village now burned. In their hearts, as a guiding flame, the Empire sent patrols. They demanded obedience. They punished some who faltered, but every act of suppression only reinforced the networks of resistance, teaching humanity that courage grows fastest when it is most tested, that unity grows stronger when it is threatened, and that the fury of a world awakened cannot be crushed by fear alone. Plans for sabotage grew bolder, coordination improved, communications expanded across oceans, through forests, over mountains. They learned to move as one, even without armies, even without fleets. Their power lay in connection, in willpower, in the determination to fight against oppression. In every city, a spark flared, in every village, a flame, and soon those sparks would come together to form a fire that the Empire could not extinguish. For Earth had discovered a force that the Empire had never measured, a force not found in technology, not found in fleets, not found in weapons, a force that grew with every injustice, endured every sorrow, shared every life, remembered, a force that would rise until the planet itself demanded reckoning, and the Empire would finally understand the cost of underestimating the human spirit. The Empire believed that Earth had been subdued, that the planet's people were broken, and that the death of a single child had silenced the will of billions, but they were wrong, for beneath the surface, A storm had been gathering, a storm fed by grief, by anger, by loss, by every injustice endured since the first ship had appeared in the sky, and every heartbeat carried a determination that no weapon could destroy. Across continents, the networks of resistance coordinated silently, yet with precision. Families, workers, students, and elders shared knowledge, shared skills, shared courage. The Empire monitored communications and controlled skies and oceans, but it could not monitor the human spirit, could not stop the pulse of a planet that had remembered how to rise. The streets filled with whispers became streets filled with strategy, streets filled with movement, invisible to those who relied only on force. The child whose life had been stolen had become a symbol, a beacon whose memory inspired acts of defiance. From the smallest gestures to the largest operations, children hid messages in plain sight. Workers sabotaged machinery that fed the Empire fleets. Citizens gathered intelligence with a patience and skill that no conquest had ever prepared the Empire for, and everywhere those acts built momentum that could not be contained. When the first coordinated strikes occurred, the Empire was shocked, for it had measured power only in ships, in weapons, in soldiers, not in the unity and will of billions. Earth struck at key supply points, communication hubs, and energy stations, not with fleets, but with precision and knowledge, and every victory, however small, reverberated across the planet, teaching people that resistance was possible, teaching them that the fury they had kept in their hearts could be unleashed. In cities once silent under the weight of occupation, citizens rose on rooftops, waving hidden banners in defiance. In villages, fires burned, not in anger but in signal, lighting the hills for distant allies to see. Every act multiplied, every gesture inspired, and the Empire realized too late that the seed of rebellion had been planted in the moment they took the life of one innocent child. A life that should have been meaningless in their eyes had become the catalyst for the awakening of an entire world. The Empire scrambled its forces, tried to reassert control, but their weapons could not touch the connections that bound humanity together. Their patrols were met with clever resistance, their ships intercepted by strikes they could not predict, and in every failed attempt their understanding deepened too late. They had underestimated the strength that comes from unity, the power of memory, and the rage that rises from injustice. For the first time in history, Earth did not merely survive, it fought back, not with fleets of its own, but with the undeniable force of a planet determined to reclaim its dignity and life. And the Empire understood in that moment that conquest is not only about power, it is about underestimating those who endured the cost of cruelty. The mistake they had made in killing a child had awakened a fury that no chain could bind and no fleet could crush. The sky was filled with the hum of ships, in the streets with the movement of millions, yet the real power lay in the hearts of the people, in the resolve that had grown from sorrow, in the unity that had risen from grief. And the Empire could only watch as Earth finally stood, not as a planet of subjects, but as a planet of warriors, a planet awakened and unstoppable, a planet whose fury would echo across the stars for all time.